My name is Julie Knight. I'm an artist, and a lot of my practice is actually about health and disease and visualising illness. I've done a lot of work on things like cancer research and also cancer patients' experience of their illnesses and things like that. This sort of step into oceans is an interesting sidestep for me, but as you'll see, there's a kind of connection between thinking about human and creature health and things like that. There's a much more functional connection about medicines from the sea. I work mainly in glass, which I'm very passionate about working with glass, and it provides a kind of set of interesting technical and creative challenges that I really enjoy. Then in the end, it's a kind of means to an end, and I'm really interested in what it can convey about those kind of topics and our relationships with non-humans as well, particularly in relation to this project. This is a really different kind of presentation. It's going to be much more kind of off the cuff, and it's very much a kind of practitioner's account of working on a very particular project. One of the things about my practice is that I work quite often in collaboration, often with scientists about their research, sometimes with individuals about their kind of particular stories. And I really love that kind of thing of working with others to generate ideas. And we were talking beforehand about how sometimes when you work with other people, you end up somewhere completely different to the way that either of you would have gone if you had been working separately. And I really enjoy that aspect of collaborative working. And today I'm going to tell you all about my Marine Museum of Lost Potential, which is a collaboration with two researchers at the National Oceanography Centre. The start of the Marine Museum of Lost Potential was actually this piece, which predates it. I've been sitting around during the pandemic. I'm lucky enough to have a studio at home, which meant that I spent the whole of the lockdowns just head down in the studio playing with things, and everyone was very disconnected from their normal life, and I wandered off from doing I'd been working on a commission about drug discovery, cancer drug discovery, and when I finished it after the first lockdown, I was like, I need to play, I need to do something completely different. And I'd been reading an article about the study of nudibranchs and sea slugs in Australia and how they noticed them all moving, and that actually they were a way of kind of tracking sea temperature because they exist in a very kind of specific set of temperatures. And when the sea temperature was changing, so the nudibranchs moved to be somewhere that was more comfortable for them. And I was also reading all sorts of stuff about plastic pollution, and I was like, oh my goodness, wouldn't it be really interesting if sea slugs and plastic bottles hybridized and became these new kind of creatures? So my Strange Creatures piece that I made probably in the second lockdowns or whatever was a kind of whimsical idea about these hybrids between plastic bottles and sea slugs. And then I thought about it, and I thought I enjoy doing whimsical stuff, but it was very ungrounded, and I felt that it would be really useful and interesting to make a piece or a series of pieces that were grounded in actual research rather than just off the top of my head. So I made contact with the National Oceanography Centre and said, I'm really interested in doing some work with you. Is there anything you'd like to work with me? And I was really lucky in that one of their team, a researcher called Tammy Horton, got back to me. She is the curator, next slide please, of the Discovery collections at the National Oceanography Centre. She's also a taxonomist, which I learned was somebody who describes new species makes the record of what that new species is, so for the good of science. And she also does a number of research projects. I went to visit her and several times, and we chatted about what she does and her research interests. She was researching, at that time she was working on a survey of an area in the Pacific called the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, which is an area that is scheduled potentially for deep sea mining. She was also working on a project called Deep End, which was about finding potential bioactive substances from deep ocean sources which could potentially have uses for drugs or other kind of human concerns. And she also explained a lot to me about taxonomy and the processes of taxonomy and describing new creatures. So I got to see the Discovery collection, which is basically, as you can see on this slide, racks and racks of jars of creatures. The collection has been going since 1925, when the RSS Discovery first started bringing samples back. And it's an absolutely brilliant place. It's like they're all in kilner jars, the kind of jars you put jam, preserved fruits in and things. But instead, there are just jars and jars of these amazing creatures. A lot of them have some very beautiful jars, which I haven't got any slides of in the presentation. Very beautiful, of the very kind of, I'm going to use the word charismatic creatures. They're things with big jaws or amazing kind of ethereal fans. Or we talked quite a lot about colour actually, and she was saying that the depths that she and I were mainly talking about is around 5 kilometres under the ocean surface. So the areas that they've been working on a lot were the Porcupine Abyssal Plain, which is off the coast of Britain and is around 5 kilometres deep, and the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, which similarly 4 to 5 kilometres deep, which is almost beyond the idea of being that much below water. And she was saying at those depths, creatures are either colourless or often shades of red, dark reds and purples, very few other colours, because it doesn't make any sense, there's so little light. So as part of all of this, it's not important that you can read the text of this, but part of this, she introduced me to these kind of taxonomic descriptions in which to name a new species or to describe a new species, to have it noted as a new species for science. These papers are written very detailed descriptions, very detailed drawings. It takes, she said, often to do a full description of a new species. It would take scientists 2 to 3 months of work to note and describe everything. So actually naming and describing is something that doesn't happen for all creatures, even if they have been collected or observed, because it's actually a very kind of labour-intensive process. As I said, a number of the things that we talked about included exploration, mineral exploration and deep sea mining. And one of the things that I really captured my thinking was about the potential of mining these areas which are relatively unknown, where these polymetallic nodules sit, and they're sometimes known as sea potatoes or whatever. They're these just metallic nodules, I'm sure you're aware of them, that contain a lot of rare metals. They believe that there's probably enough of these sort of metal sources, and these are the kind of metals that we potentially would be using for batteries and things. You could make billion electric vehicle batteries from these sources, and the sources on land are actually now increasingly hard to access. A lot of attention is turning to deep sea mining. But we don't exactly know what we're disrupting by doing that. The National Oceanography Centre was one of the partners who were doing a survey of an area in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone that was scheduled for a pilot for deep sea mining. And as you can see from the figures quoted there, which are from their survey, an estimated 92% of the species they identified are new to science. In some groups of creatures, actually as many as 95% are new to science, meaning that the number of species that we actually know about and would even recognise as existing are remarkably tiny compared to what's there. And we discussed things like the importance of taxonomy and the baseline knowledge to even understand what we're doing to the environment, or even as a starting point, which we're not really there, especially as these areas are very difficult to access. To do research, it's incredibly expensive. the technology is not straightforward. It's notable that with the development of technologies and marine exploration, it's become increasingly clear that marine creatures are potentially a very rich source of bioactive compounds and potentially for drugs to treat human ailments. The list there is actually a list of approved drugs since between the 60s and 2021 that have been approved for human use. The majority of them are actually chemotherapies, but they also are finding antimicrobial uses. I mean, the over-the-counter treatment for cold sores, Virax, is drawn from a sponge. So these are potentially incredibly useful to us. All this came together in my head. I have a kind of passion for museums, actually. I think they're very interesting institutions about how we share knowledge, and they sit within some kind of interesting kind of paradigms in that they tend to very much adopt the prevailing cultural frameworks that are present at the time that they were created. And one of the lovely things about museums in this country certainly is that you can see that history in the museums themselves just by looking at them. So I decided, or I came up with the idea of creating a marine museum of lost potential, which is a kind of fictional museum of creatures that were lost to the world before they could ever be discovered. And one of the things I loved about being able to create this museum was it's really playful, it's utterly impossible by its very nature, and it's timeless as well. Which kind of, the fact that it's impossible means that sort of anything is actually possible. I started to play around with this idea and what might be the exhibits in the museum. I created its kind of own world in my imagination. This Marine Museum of Lost Potential is also part of its own kind of paradigm, and without wanting to get too self-reflexive, in some ways I'm playing with the conventions of museums and knowledge and the idea of sort of conservation of those things. But in another way, it's a kind of, it's trapped in its own conventions, or it does reflect on some of the dominant ideas of what conservation might be, stories about extinctions and things like that. And I was also very aware that as a museum which was about collecting even fictional deep sea creatures, and particularly ones that had potential for medical use, which, as you'll see, is all about how these creatures might have served humanity had they been discovered, as well as potentially being a way of communicating some of the potential that is lost along with our destruction of the marine environment. It's also very much kind of prioritising the human narrative over the non-human narrative. It's done with an awareness of that, but to me that is still something that is potentially quite problematic. So there's that kind of tension running through it. A lot of tales of extinction are very much based around the kind of really glamorous creatures. On land, those tend to be the lion, the elephant, all these kind of like amazing, very sexy creatures. And underwater, a lot of the time, and it's really interesting looking at that film that we were looking at earlier, it's the angelfish, or it's the porpoises, or it's the sharks, or whatever. And instead, the Marine Museum of Lost Potential tends to focus on the sea cucumbers, and it's trying to provide some counterexamples. What I've done also is to try and play with some of the conventions, not only of the museum as an institution, but also of a lot of the scientific kind of conventions that go with it. One of the things that I really loved doing was writing taxonomies. These are what I call my capsule creatures, and they were created to be a bit sea cucumber, but also a bit pill capsule. And the colours, you know, it's one of the things I was saying earlier. I talked to Tammy about colour. One of the reasons was she said, you don't get a lot of green and blue in the ocean floor. And I was like, no, but you do get them in antibiotics. And I want to be able to highlight that, because the idea behind these particular creatures is they're kind of amazing saviour kind of antibiotic or whatever that we never discovered because the creature was lost before it was ever found, as it were. So that's the taxonomic details of the creature, which I think is, yes, it's Medicinia antibiotica is its genus or whatever, and there's a whole narrative there behind how it was never discovered and what might have been if it had been discovered. And the finished piece, I think, is on the next slide. And this is how it's presented in its museum case with its taxonomy, these kind of strange creatures exhibited as if they were specimens in a museum. And there's some more creatures in the museum. These are the vascular creatures. They were based on veining and dendritic forms. The idea is they would have been useful cardiovascular treatments. And again, they have their taxonomy and their museum case and everything. And on the next slide, actually, I've got the labels that I put together as part of the process. And I'd say this is one of the most fun things of all, is I talked to Tammy about the conventions of naming creatures, and I was like, well, how are they named? So this, you've got family and all of this. She said, but when it gets down to the species, it's up to you. And I was like, what do you mean it's up to you? She said, it's up to you. Taxonomists across the world name species. They're species that we know are named after their discoverer, but also there are ones named after people's kids. The one that she showed me that was recently named by a colleague of hers was named after a character in Game of Thrones, because the shape of the shell around its neck was really reminiscent of the costume of that character. So she said that they're all named in Latin or Greek, and there's a fat book which has all the Latin and Greek words, especially so that you can choose them for naming. So I got hold of a copy off eBay and started naming my creatures, and then thought, well, now I can translate it back into common names. So all the common names are retranslations from the Latin. Things like laughing sea pill is the Pilularis ridibundus, which, so that was just enormous fun and light-hearted way of approaching it. These are the scar creatures, which reflect on the potential for creatures to help with sort of skin preparations, but also potentially, fictional elixirs of youth that might have existed but never did. These are the 3 existing kind of pieces so far. I'm continuing to work on the project. One of the things that I really like about it is that it can expand, like most museums don't just contain one type of thing. About to go and meet a collaborator at the University of Aberdeen who runs the Marine Biodiscovery Centre, which is where they actually try and isolate the compounds from the creatures and trying to understand the sort of ethics of that, but also the opportunities of that, and also understand just visually what that means. And I think there's potentially a place in the museum for those kind of pieces of work as well. I think the thing that I will finish with as part of this is a quote from Ursula K. Heiser, who writes about extinction narratives. So the valuation of biodiversity and efforts to protect it are profoundly cultural ventures embedded in historic traditions and value frameworks that condition which lives are appreciated and conserved and which ones are disregarded, left to die, or actively exterminated. So there you go. My Marine Museum of Lost Potential.
You didn't bring any of the creature with you?
I didn't. I thought about it actually on the way. I was thinking, I should have just popped a creature in my bag and brought it along. Actually, one of the things that I didn't mention as part of this is that one of the things actually that was instrumental in bringing this idea about for me was Tammy talked about a creature that she had come across as part of the survey they were doing, and it was a tiny amphipod, and she said it was pregnant with a single egg. And she was very struck by it because it's quite unusual for these creatures to only have a single egg. Normally they have multiple eggs, and that's what kind of protects them against sort of extinction from just predators and unfortunate incidents and things. And she said she was very touched by this creature which just had this sort of single egg, and she said, and no one will ever know about it because it's not one of the creatures that it's a priority for us to name. We don't have the resources to describe and name this creature. She said, so I know about it, and now you know about it, and nobody else will ever really know about it. And so then she said, well, my partner knows about it, my kids know about it. And I was like, oh, now I'm telling people about it. But it's like this idea that there's this creature that is somehow wonderful and precious and entirely unknown except by anecdote. This tiny group of people will never be known wider than that, but because we don't have the resources to know it intimately, and we don't have the inclination or energy or focus or determination to actually know or name it. And it's almost like, how can you care about something that you don't know and isn't named? I think it's really hard. And I'm not saying we shouldn't, I'm just saying that it's much easier to care about a lion cub than it is about a strange amphipod with a single egg that no one's ever come across.
There are just so many parallels. That's brilliant, thank you.